Hi, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see so many faces. I'm Ryan Pierce. I'm the chair of PNCA's Low Residency MFA in Visual Studies program. I want to start by acknowledging that the land where PNCA is located rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many indigenous Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of Native nations, leaders, and families, and make ongoing efforts to center indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. I invite you all to spend some time with the Arrowhead Project, a long-term installation of works by indigenous artists addressing the history of this institution and the place it occupies, which you'll find throughout the 511 building atrium out there. So this is the first of this year's summer lecture series, which will usually meet here Wednesday nights at 6 p.m., except for the next 3 weeks. Next week, Lindsay White will speak on Thursday because of the Juneteenth holiday. The following week, we have a performance instead of a lecture, as LA-based artist Gabrielle Seville is uniting low-res visual studies and low-res creative writing programs in true hybrid artist-writer fashion with her performance, Black Weirdo Art School. And that'll happen right next door at the Lemelson Galleries, on that side of the building. We're taking July 4th week off from visiting lectures, and then we'll return to Wednesdays at 6 p.m. with Yaron Michael Hakim, Rob Ree, and finally Natani Nota. I'm super excited to kick off our series tonight with Diedrick Brackens. I'm a huge fan. In a way, we're picking up some of where we left off last summer because there are some compelling connections between Diedrick's work and our talk with curator Allison Glenn, who was speaking about world building and Black myth and her research of the Detroit electronic music duo Drexciya. Drexciya developed a so-called sonic third space, including an origin myth and an epic song cycle based on the idea of an underwater country populated by survivors of the Middle Passage. Diedrick's vibrant figurative tapestries also evoke the world of myth and dreamscape, but in a way that's arguably more open-ended and unfixed in time and space. His lexicon and his process draws on his own body, on his poetry, the poetry of others, as well as his childhood in rural Mexia, Texas, where he learned to sew from his grandmother. Catfish, unicorns, and elegant human silhouettes inhabit the world of these weavings, where the figures float above what one writer termed cosmographic abstractions. They're beautiful, mysterious, and radiate the warmth and approachability of their handmade nature. The Studio Museum of Harlem awarded Brackens the 2018 Wein Prize, and he received the Textile Society of America's Branford Elliott Award for excellence in fiber art the same year. He's had solo exhibitions at the New Museum, the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, among many others. And he's just coming off a wildly successful double venue solo show with Jack Shaman Gallery in New York. Generously to join us tonight, please welcome Diedrick Brackens.
Hello, how's everyone? Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Ryan. And thank you all for having me. I can open this. Come on. There it is. So fitting, I'll start with the unicorn. So I have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to go through about half of them, talking and thinking, and then the rest I might just like race through or talk about if something comes up in the Q&A. But I have been starting with this slide a lot because I think this is a moment in my studio, 2014, where I really started to kind of synthesize what I wanted the work to be about, what I wanted it to do, and this kind of fusion of sort of the thoughts meeting the the technical, the weaving, kind of finding ways to sensitively articulate with the materials in the same way that I was thinking. And I have thought about the unicorn originally as this way to think about textile histories and traditions, and using making nods to the unicorn tapestries, but also just the great history of tapestry weaving and its interest in capturing story and myth, and trying to be kind of in dialogue with that in this contemporary moment and way. So I've reorganized my slides in a way that I've never done before. So part of me is like, oof, what am I doing? Why did I do this? But I'm kind of thinking through, I kind of like zoomed out on PowerPoint as far as I could to see all of the images that I imported, and started to think about like, what is the work about? What is the work doing that maybe are undercurrents that I don't privilege, instead of thinking about bodies of work or exhibitions. I really wanted to sort of think about why I return to certain images again and again and again. And so I think one of those big themes for me is love, and thinking about relationships, tenderness, romantic love, filial love, all of these things. And inside of that, there is a biblical story that I think inspires me greatly, which is the prodigal son. For those of you who don't know, the prodigal son is a child of this important rich man who runs off into the world, wants to experience and become oneself, but sort of, you do that full circle. I think it's common in coming of age stories. It's a story that we like to tell ourselves about ourselves, that I'm really interested in, how we kind of slither back to some sort of original state. I think for me, it's kind of trying to access oneself, or yourself through community, through family, et cetera, that I'm really kind of compelled by. So, someone who I am deeply in love with and in dialogue with is a poet by the name of Essex Hemphill, who was a Black queer poet who lived and died at the height of the AIDS epidemic. He passed away in 1995. And he has a book called Ceremonies, which collects all of his writings. And I was gifted this book probably in 2000 and, time is weird, 2008, 9? And many years after this work had been done and this man had passed away, I felt like he was talking to me through this book, and naming experiences that I was just starting to be able to articulate and think through. And so one of his poems is called American Wedding. He has another poem called Song for Rapunzel. And I think he was maybe one of the first creatives that I responded to who was taking story and myth and finding ways to see himself or insert his own lived experiences into them to help himself and others make sense of them. And I think he just gave me language to maybe create visuals. I think I'm thinking a lot about these kind of flat horizon lines, big skies, thinking about this place that I'm from. I am not a city person. I have not been a city person until I moved to Los Angeles. From very rural context to this kind of huge sprawling place, I think I kind of carry that place with me and try to privilege it in the work, and sometimes do work to create possibilities that I did not experience growing up there always as a queer Black person in a very rural place. I think a lot about water, about this particular place in my hometown, which is a lake. So there are, I can dwell on that later though. I think there's just a lot of Christian imagery and ideas that I'm trying to work through in rehab and maybe crack open to expose these queer possibilities. It's hard to maybe make out here, but these two figures are kind of situated between these arches. They have halos. The color on color makes some of that stuff almost indistinguishable, which I appreciate, and I think for me it does the work of maybe this kind of surreal, situating these tender, seemingly innocuous possibilities in this, like if you squint, there's these kind of magical things that kind of break. Love a tub. Can't get enough of a tub. I would just weave tubs if I could. I think that vessel for me is like so charged with possibilities for romance, for leisure, for rest, for cleansing. Like they are cauldrons for the body, and there's something about that that I like to reflect on and capture and think about. Like what happens in that space, where we get to go, how interior we get to be. And it's something I love to like return to again and again in the studio and the work. And not all love is easy. And I think this for me is one of those moments where I think less about maybe romance and our capacity to be with and see each other and make space for one another. And even when we do, like there's always kind of tension and struggle embedded in that. So the next 3 images are kind of a semi-triptych, where I started thinking about the ability of color maybe to narrate or move story along. So it's kind of making these almost, I don't know how to think about them, comic strips, cells that maybe gesture to what might come next, and trying to spend a lot of time thinking about these domestic interior spaces where we find textiles and what they kind of offer to us. Tubs. And I think a lot about language, and I think of myself sometimes as a frustrated poet. There's this part of me that's like, I don't know how I ended up, it seems like a hairline that I went one way or the other. And so often these titles are self-generated. Sometimes they're coming from other references, or a combination of the two. I feel like there is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are the ones that get crafted for us, especially as we make art and it goes into the world and other people have stakes in it and want to craft beautiful, simple narratives of like who we are. There are a lot of parts or components of, I think, what the work is about and does for me that get kind of minimized because it doesn't look as good on the headline, or maybe it's I think it's too erotic. And so I've been toying with like how to maybe push those things forward in moments where they get turned down. And I think one of the larger components of the work is thinking about textile history, is thinking about the kind of stakes that are embedded in a textile or a fiber or a craft practice. And for me, it is something I've been conscious about keeping valent in the work, because it is very easy to think of these as woven paintings. Whereas for me, like the fact that they are woven means something. I think it ties them to a different set of histories. It means that I get to be in dialogue with folks that I would not otherwise. It pushes back against the contemporary art world's impulses to trendset and make in a particular way for me. And it puts a loop around the people who I think I am in community with. So often I try to privilege things that textiles do, like plaids and stripes, and borrowing these kind of quilter languages, thinking about quilt patterns, thinking about how color and pattern are imbued often with meaning. They're not just decoration. And this kind of oscillation between abstraction and figuration, or a particular kind of legibility. And thinking about folks like the Gee's Bend quilters, who are, I think, arbiters of, they hold a lot of stake in like what American culture is and how it's formulated and what aesthetics mean to us. Using quilt codes, which are these taking traditional American quilting patterns and imbuing them with meanings that are said to have helped enslaved folks navigate to their freedom, and trying to kind of re-articulate and circulate these in the work and the aesthetics. To think about, again, what I think textiles do well is speak in a language that makers and folks who belong to those communities can decode and read, and use and apply to our sense of self, how we dress, how we might think about creating space for ourselves, liberating ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm also borrowing from these West African strip weaving traditions. So it's these European tapestry traditions, quilt patterns, all these aesthetics that I think I have inherited by being a Black person living in America, and I'm trying to kind of distill and twist and invade and ask to do new things. I have woven a lot of dogs, and I've been trying lately to reformulate what they might be able to offer to the work, but originally they were a way to be in direct conversation with the history of European tapestry making, where like if you see a dog in a European tapestry, it is often a sign of the hunt. It is a sign of like going after the noble beast. It is a sign of the owner's ability to fund a hunt, to go to wild places, and it also it prefigures the idea of colonialism. So it is that like people went away, they saw things, they came back, and they wanted to depict rhinos and unicorns and lions and all of these things, and take on maybe the characteristics of those animals for themselves, right? That they were fierce, they were beautiful. I don't know, like all of the things that you might attribute to a lion or a horse, or a unicorn. And I think so embedded in this very soft, beautiful technique is all of this highly coded information, as well as like a sort of laying dominion over the earth and claiming this thing for oneself. And so in blood, in war, battle. And so I've been thinking, like, how then do I insert myself into this history, into this craft? And if these are the stakes of what story we tell, like, how do I think about the dog as a symbol of the state, as a symbol of the police, as a symbol of the military, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm often, again, thinking about myth. There are these kind of multi-headed dogs, thinking about Cerberus, and I'm not gonna remember Cerberus's brother's name. There is another horse. There's another dog that has two heads instead of multi or three, like Cerberus. That sorry, I'm sharing too much information, but I'm gonna keep going. So Hercules is given tasks by Hera that he must complete, and then he can become a god, a full god instead of a half god. Two of these tasks are dealing with like capturing these two dogs, Cerberus and the one I can't think of the name of. And so this is his original final task was to catch the two-headed dog. He does it, and she's like, I'm going to give you two more tasks. And so the final one is to catch Cerberus. And so I've been essentially thinking about tying together these histories of enslavement, thinking about how dogs are used as an arm of the state to do things that a police officer couldn't do to a person, right? Like you get to maybe mutilate or abuse a person in a way that like you are not responsible for. So just thinking about how in this country dogs have sort of been in service of awful things, creating this image that has, I can't see it, I can't point to it, but the North Star in it, to kind of tie these myths and realities together. I can't ever sit in one place with my own imagery, so I have often these moments where I think about if I'm going to kind of present the horror, the possibility of horror, terror, violence, then I need to always have a way to float the possibility of an alternative. So, for instance, having these figures who kind of are building this force field up around themselves at this moment that could be attack. The Joseph Beam is another poet who is in conversation with Essex Hemphill, who says, black men loving black men is the most revolutionary act. So thinking about that quote is kind of how I arrive at this title. So there's a place that I know called Mexia, Texas, which is where I'm from. And during the pandemic, I spent a lot of time I'm a self-appointed historian in my family. I spent a lot of time trying to find names and records and who was born where to who at what time. And in that work, sometimes I encounter stories that the folks that I am related to would have experienced in their time. And so it leads me to make things or do research that was not where I intended to go, or maybe augment the art. But this particular piece was from a series of works that was thinking about that place. And the catfish is maybe my unintended like calling card. I've made a lot of works with catfish. I'm like, okay, this is the last one, and then I'm like, I have some more to do. So I kind of had these works in the show as bookends to think about maybe the two animals, one of which was the adversary and one of which maybe is the creature that I identify with or think of as offering some sort of possibilities of how to maybe think of oneself. But they are super present in the like literal and the figurative imagination of Texans. I think in the food, they show up as mascots. In the terrain, and for me, I've been interested in weaving animals that are thought of as maybe unclean, unsavory, pest, scavengers, bottom feeders, all of the ways that you might malign a living thing. Because for me, if tapestry historically has woven like these noble creatures and wanted us to sort of like, or the patron to identify with them, then like what could be maybe the animal of the people. I feel so like I'm advancing a crazy claim, but for me, there is embedded this idea: if I lift it up, if I weave it, I'm making it. I am redeeming it. I am making it special. I am making it something to consider. I've spent time with it. It gets, to be loved in a particular way. And if we look at books, literature, news, often folks of color, Black folks, are talked about as having these kind of animal-like characteristics. So for me, it's like, okay, how can I invade that thing and make it turn it over on itself? I think that this work is I have done things in my life that I have come to have complicated relationships with, and this is one of them. So I made this work in 2018. It was a part of an exhibition called Made in LA at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and it's a big biennial show that they do every other year, where they show what's going on in the LA art world. And this is kind of right at the moment where I'd started making figurative work. I wanted to do explicitly figurative work, and I wanted to say particular things. And so I made this work reflecting on an event that happened in my hometown in 1981, prior to my birth, that has shaped my sense of self, reality, and I think exploded into the national media at the time that it happened. But essentially, 3 young men were arrested on suspicion of possession of marijuana at a Juneteenth celebration, one of the largest at one point in the country, that happened in my hometown on this lake that I've been mentioning. And because essentially 20,000 people or more come to this small town and go to the rim of this lake to celebrate the day that enslaved folks were freed in Texas. And also it is a site that is very close to where these folks would have heard this message for the first time. They were put in handcuffs, transported across the lake. Halfway across, the boat capsizes. The 4 officers either are rescued or swim to safety, and the 3 young men drown. And so I know this story like the back of my hand because I've heard it my whole life, and I wanted to be in dialogue with it. So I made this piece thinking about these 3 catfish as, the souls of these young men, this lake or vessel being their final resting place where they are transformed. The handcuffs sort of unclasped, opened is maybe the easiest word, almost in the shape of a butterfly, to think about trying to use visual work to do some of the work of kind of transforming a horrific thing, world making, building a space for something else to happen, thinking about a surreal possibility. And absolutely love this work. I think it does the things that I set out to do in the work, and I can't talk about it ever again. I think it caught a particular, I think in the wake of BLM, in the wake of nationalizing Juneteenth, all of these things, it has become bigger than like me. It's like taken on its own life, and it is the thing that I like will not include into a PowerPoint, or someone will ask to reprint it or ask me to talk about this event, and I'm like I'm not. I have become an unreliable steward of a history that is mine, but I also belongs to so many other people, so I can't be the mouthpiece for it. And I dwell on this to maybe make a point about what our responsibilities are as artists, what we should be thinking about in the studio, and like what real work we might be called upon to do. And I don't think people go into the studio realizing that you can become a witness, a journalist, an expert. You can provide people comfort. Like there are all these auxiliary possibility, potential lives for artists. And I think they're important, and we have to take them seriously, and you have to know what your stakes are before you are tested. Sorry, there it is. Catfish. So, I mean, they've started to, every time I weave a catfish or think about the catfish, I think they take on all these new potential meanings. They become nourishment. They close the loop between life and death to me, for me. They sit kind of in that above, below, middle of the water column. So I think they have this kind of relationship to life and death, or above and below. Yeah, and I just love that there's maybe in the world that I've built this closed loop between ancestor, living, nourished, fed. Okay. Okay, this is kind of the like, I had an idea for every section. This is kind of grab baggy, but I think there is this. It maybe hits on a lot of the things I was saying in the other suites of works around textiles and what they can do that is inherent to them. There's a lot of things about my relationship to the land and how I think tenuous it can be at times, or how at awe and peace one could be in the landscape, and how it can also be this charged, terrifying space to be out of doors. I think it's a night, the out of doors is a space of ritual or potential ritual that I'm always interested in. Dance, the lyrical kind of movements that the figures in the work often find themselves in. And there was for me at the time of making this work, these reflections across time of 2020 being this year of upheaval, and thinking about, in the research I was doing, finding all these moments of unrest and racially motivated like crimes in the place that I was from. So having these kind of mirrored figures, and also a lot of like things being burnt down across the country in 2020 and in the 20s and early 20th century. Warmth of Other Suns is the name of a book by a writer named Isabel Wilkerson, which does a lot of historicizing and talking about the Great Migration, thinking about how Black folks got up and left the South over decades to go elsewhere. And I am one of the few people in my family who does not live in Texas. And at the time I read this book, it was kind of destabilizing to think about a group of folks who stayed and like what one has to go through and build maybe to be in that space. And then what it is to depart, to leave. Okay, can I tell one more mythical story? I think this is the last one. I love reading mythology of all from wherever because it's interesting to me to think about the stories that like are baked into culture and like what ways we think of ourselves, shape ourselves, inform the next generation, and like often how weird and problematic some of those stories are, but also then sometimes how they empower people that we don't imagine having been empowered in those moments. So I mean, I think about folks of color, I think about women, I think about queer folks, and how often like those, they offer spaces in our storytelling and imagination that aren't offered in our lived experiences, in our news, in the ways that we actually relate to those folks on maybe like I'll say on a state level, because like I want to, I don't want to implicate like communities, because I think we do the work of holding space and showing up for each other at our best. The Minotaur was my point. So I will see in stories that I know so intimately that I don't think about them, these new possibilities as I revisit them again and again. But being from Texas, you can't, you like carry it in your body in a very particular way. Like it is, for all the ways that it is terrible, you are proud of it, it's great, it's the best, it's the biggest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there is a kind of bodiness involved in like being from that place that I like embrace and push away. But I think it is the most American place in the country, and I mean that as with all insult and all like praise. Like at its best and at its worst, it like does something. Fight me. But so the Minotaur is born out of his mother. I'm not going to use names because I'll forget them all. Being cursed by God to want to have sex with a bull, divine bull, and she gets a contraption made to make this possible that looks like a cow. And to me, being from Texas, having that rural context, but also thinking about the longhorn, which is a very particular Texan creature, I felt like there are all these projections mapped onto people from Texas, period. There are all these projections mapped onto Black masculine bodies, and to them be kind of holding a lot of these identities, it's sort of like there are a lot of stereotypes that I wanted to like deal with and be irreverent about and be serious about, and offer up this kind of like this arrangement of things to think about that. That's the best way I can put that. That's tasteful and delicate. And I think the more I make, the more interested I am in refusing a narrative that can be specifically intensely pinned down. And I think that there is some power in like asserting refusal or making images that could be read in a multiplicity of ways. And for me, this is maybe one of the first works where I had this moment where I was like, I don't have to give it all away. There's a series of memes that occur right at the end of a year and the beginning of a year, where like there is a person walking up a set of stairs and they're like, everything I'm taking with me into 2025 or everything I'm leaving behind. It usually has this idea around sort of like, what is the system that we're in? There's this capitalist idea built into it that like you need to be going this way and doing a certain set of things. I think it's also baked into the art world, and all of our systems that I've been trying to make images that maybe think through that or refuse kind of like building on that idea. And like offering less of the figure, et cetera, all these things that I think you sort of make a good object. Okay, I don't know if I'm going to say anything else, but I'm going to go through like 10 slides. And so I said that, and then these slides are from the show that I just had in New York. And that's it.
Fantastic. We have some time for Q&A, and what I will do is bring the microphone to you, and then you can ask your question, and please hand it back to me afterwards. I'll bring it to the next person.
Hi. Have you ever used a tapestry as like a blanket, or has like any of your work transcended the draping orientation?
Thank you for this question. How do I? Let's see. There have been works that have not been presented up vertically on the wall. Jesus, this makes me so anxious. So there have been works that are floor bound, for instance. So this is the installation shot of the show that I was talking about that this work was in. And I am a person who likes to have work that goes with the season. So if I have a show in spring, I'm thinking about spring. If I have a show that I know will happen during Juneteenth will happen, I used to be compulsive about trying to make a gesture towards that. This is pre it becoming a national holiday, which clearly it sounds like I have mixed feelings about. But yeah, so there have been works that have been presented like this. There are also things that are just not textiles, or they are sculptural, or there's kind of a performative element. But I don't know which other, but a blanket, I have not made a blanket explicitly. I've made a table runner. I've made things that like operate in this functional space, but I think they often get kind of ring fenced by the institution. Like people are like, oh, we don't really know if we're gonna let people step on it. And I'm like, no, let's see what it's like. And they're like, no. Yeah. Thank you for that question. This is a little chaotic. Turn this back off.
Thank you so much. This lecture is amazing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your making process, especially as you've scaled up for this recent show to a pretty massive scale.
Absolutely. So I weave. I know that that is apparent, but I realized that I didn't like to spend any time talking about process, and it is important to me. But I tend to work at a very particular, about 3 foot wide width. And all of the yarn except for the black usually is hand dyed in the studio. So there's a lot of, in addition to the weaving, sewing, dyeing, we often make the drawing at some point is made at scale so that it can be used to as a thing to work off of. So it gets cut up and destroyed, pinned to the weaving. I'm using a couple techniques. So this is a double woven cloth, meaning that like wherever you see blue, there's red on the reverse. Wherever you see red on the front, there's blue on the reverse. So 2 layers of fabric kind of running concurrently. And it's almost possible to tell here, but there's a smaller gauge red thread that runs through. Maybe it's shallow, I can't tell. And it holds the black yarn only to the surface, almost like a woven embroidery. But then all the panels are sewn together so that I can work to make wider, longer things by just adding another panel, adding another panel, adding another panel. But I have a studio manager and 2 part-time folks who work in the studio to help me do all of these processes. So it is not that like I'm sitting in the studio alone doing these things. But at every juncture, essentially, the folks who I work with are able to help me do all of the kind of technical stuff. Did I answer that question? Okay. Bless you.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. This is wonderful. Along the lines of technique, I was noticing the strings not only on the bottom, so you're breaking space, and some of the reading that you had sent over for us as students was mentioning imaginary landscapes and the use of outdoors. So I was just wondering about, in the figures particularly, the strings that are left that break the figure.
Yeah.
Is that
Absolutely.
So how?
I think that sounds like tropical aesthetics, maybe. I don't know what I assigned. But I need a different image. I think for me there are a couple things going on. One of which is, that's not it. That's fine. I am trained, I went to 2 universities, and at both of which I studied textiles. And there is a lot of discourse, I think, historically in textiles around achieving perfection. And what that typically means is that you have a surface, both front and back, that are clean. There are no sort of threads like this. You've addressed, I'm just gonna walk over here. You've addressed like this or this. Both of these things are wrong. Like people who are like in the know are like, who would ever do that? That's disgusting. And I think at the time when I was learning, I felt like I was having a lot of not conversations in critique. Like what people wanted to do in a textile critique was think about like, what yarn did you use? And like, how did you braid the fringe? Did you hem the bottom? What does the back look like? Oh, the back is atrocious. You really need to work on like tucking your tails and like sewing that thing down. And like at no point would we have talked about like the conceptual thrust of the work, right? And I learned how to do all of these things eventually, but I think I just got to a point where I was like, I don't care. And if I just make it bad, then they have to at some point talk about the content. If they're like, oh, it's never gonna have like the X, Y, and Z thing, then like I have to talk about the content. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think once I started having multidisciplinary critiques or being in spaces where there weren't just weavers or textile people, they were thinking so differently about art and like what kind of emotive quality was in a line and these things that like I had never gotten a chance to talk about. And so I was like, oh, like I want to chase that. I want to also, I think, make a set of aesthetics for myself that like disrupt this history that I'm so interested in, and make possible maybe a different orientation to like what mastery or skillfulness looks like. And I think textile people, craft people want to erase the hand. Like a good thing is a thing that seems like it could have been machined, and like that is not important. That is not how I want to make objects, I guess.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about how you talked about both making space and this idea of the power of refusal. And I first came to your work through a book called Queer Threads. And what I'm hoping you might be willing to talk about is kind of how do you think about position your work, your queerness, in terms of like not wanting to be tokenized, pigeonholed, but also wanting to make space?
There's always one question where I'm like, damn it. It's good. It's a good question. I really think it's a good question. I don't always know, and I think sometimes I'm just backing into something that feels true and right. And I think there are times where, I don't know, now I'm like, gotta look at my own images to fill this out. I think it is a moving target, and it's some of what I was sort of saying around that one particular work. But I mean, I think that there is a part of me that sort of tries to sometimes make images that aren't readily available to all audiences, right? Like where someone with a particular set of information will read a set of things that like will not be on a wall label, will not have been disclosed to a curator or a journalist or whatever. And so I think I am okay with multiple reads of the work as long, and not closing it down as long as people have enough information to know some of the source information, right? Like every work is not, the silhouettes are not a shadow that everyone can jump into and have that experience, and neither are they completely dependent on my experience to be read. And so these are things that I try to like stick to and articulate, and out of rooms like this, I try to be very conscious of what I say the work is doing and what it's about, because I know that it will be reprinted again and again and again. Yeah. That's not a good answer, but that's what I got.
as you're developing the visual language of your practice, at what point does the concept come in? Like a tub is a cauldron. At what point does that motif transition into the concepts and the research that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm on like tub 4 or 5 at this point. So I think in the first one I have a feeling, and I also don't think, I think of thinking and making are two very different modes, and for me they don't happen together. Like I think of what I want to make sometimes and what I think it means, but not until I make it can I like really fuse those two things together. And sometimes I think I have to be really honest. Like, did it happen? Is what I said it was what it is? And I think sometimes no. And then other times I'm like, oh, this is what I actually meant, what I thought I meant. And so I think the first one I made, I just was like, I just want to see someone like chilling. Like, I just want somebody to be relaxed, and like that is important for some reason. And I think the further I made them, I was like, oh, this is what you're about, or this is what is happening. And even what I was saying about this exercise, you know, having almost 100 objects to look at, I was like, oh wow, you really like lean in this direction or that direction, and like that this work and this work and this work are about different things when you get granular, but like, oh, here's maybe a sweep of things that you really care about. I feel like you asked me something else that I'm not answering. Okay. All right.
Thanks again. Sorry to add to so many questions.
I love it.
It's just so good. So I guess I have an addendum to that question about you used the words illegibility, refusal, but then the first time you talked about illegibility was in relation to abstraction. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. I mean, obviously I've seen you kind of divide it on your site between sort of figurative works and abstract works, and I'm wondering if abstraction becomes a vehicle for a kind of refusal or illegibility for you. Just like if you could talk a little bit more about how you think about it and what it performs for you in the work.
Absolutely. I have to take that website down. It like gets me into so much trouble. I think when I first started making artwork, I was already sort of bent towards a figurative impulse. And I think in those early like undergraduate critiques, I had the horrific experience of like spending time on something, making something that I loved, that like meant something emotionally, but like intellectually to me. Like it had meaning. And I think I went into critiques where people were, I don't have any bad feelings about it, so I want what I say next to sound right. But where people were clumsy and they didn't know what they were saying, and they didn't know how to articulate like what they thought they were seeing. And that left me being like, oh my God, my fill in all the isms classmates are like terrible people, and they are representative of like what other people will see when they like encounter my work in the world. So it quickly, I think intellectually I had these leanings where I was like, oh, if the work gets abstract, I save the figure. I think about the figures not as me, but like I save them from the harm that might be visited upon them by a lazy critique, or like a uninformed critique, I should say. And so I stopped making figurative work because I was like, I think I've heard people say this kind of thing before, but I was like, abstraction can like say everything. It can save the world. It's so pure, and like I had all these like, you know, like you hear it, and you unlearn those things maybe as you go along. But I think when I came back into figuration, it was for many reasons, and I thought like, okay, there's a lot of dialogue. People have read and heard and said a lot of things. Like there's a scaffolding that just exists in our popular consciousness that makes it possible for me to not to carry that anxiety, and like I need to trust the viewer. Like there are so many viewers who have so many different ways of approaching things. But I think working in textiles again, most of it is inherently abstract, and like all of it is highly coded with information. And I think it is in part to be in dialogue with African American quilters in that long tradition, and the idea that there was a moment in our history where there was a group of people in this population of Americans who could largely not read or write, but they were skilled and they could articulate themselves in material, and they could encode, decode, transmit messages. And like, to me, this is a big like wellhouse of why I think textiles is my thing, why I think they have to have some sort of abstraction embedded in them, because it is that kind of like transmission, encoding, decoding, that lines, stripes, and colors could like say something so specific and maybe like potentially life-changing or revelatory, is like something that I want to claim and like use, to like offer something and to obscure things and like navigate how you might like move through the literal and like psychic space of the world and like hold things back for yourself. And I think people have always done that, right? Like, I can't think of a good example that's not the hanky code right now, but like people always use flags. We use all of these things to sort of like raise our message, and we don't want everyone to know always what we mean and how we're using a thing, or how that signals. And so for me, it is that I just trust that some people will know and some people won't. And that's okay.
We'll take one more question.
So I also use poetry as inspiration for my visual work, and I appreciate what you said about there was a fine line between you going one way, going the other. And I'm curious, for the pieces that do have a piece of poetry or writing as their inspiration, I'm trying to think of how to word this, but I guess, how important is it to you that someone know the source material, or are you simply translating it through your filter?
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to stop doing this now because it's almost over. But I think that it is a little bit of both things. Like, I know that sometimes someone is coming in, they're looking at the object, and they decide, I'm into it, I'm going to look at it a little bit longer, or they're like, next. And for that person who's going to look a little bit longer, maybe they're going to read the title. Like, not everyone's going to know the title. I don't know the titles of my own work at this point. But I think then some of those people are going to be like, what does that mean? And Google it. And that person is my person. I'm like, that person is my person. Because sometimes there's absolutely nothing to find. I made it up. And like, it means something, but like they won't necessarily get to that next place if they thought they would. But sometimes you will. And this is one of those cases where I can't remember if I made this up or not. But it was in relationship to a reading that I usually assign, but I don't know if I did, bear with me, I promise I'm almost done, by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and it's called The Shape of My Impact. And she is writing about the Black radical feminist tradition, and she's talking specifically at points, and her career has been dedicated to Audre Lorde. But she's talking about survival, and she's essentially saying, we have kind of come to this point in popular culture where we say, you know, we don't want you to survive, we want you to thrive. And so she is saying the radical potential of survival is that, like, you found a way to stay alive in the world, and that, like, means something. You've had to have an extraordinary amount of, like, skill, tenacity, and cleverness that, like, we don't appreciate as knowledge that, like, means something. And, like, those things get distilled and passed on and passed on and passed on, right? no one's going to get there with this particular title, and also they can, if that makes sense. Like, I think it says that. So there is the economy of language that I also hope like flips over when people read it, maybe, or it keys them to a piece of writing that they might go read, that then they'll be like, oh, this idea, this image, this feeling is something that I want to chase or know more about. But it is an exercise that like excites and animates me, and I hope like there are people who it will do that for, is the short answer of that question.
Yeah. One more time for Diedrick Brackens.